Welcome to this little how-to guide, produced by Adobe Camera Club, Redruth. Adobe Camera Club, the friendly camera club, meets at the Adobe Community Institute every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. New members always welcome. In this guide, we will be looking at editing images in Adobe Camera RAW, and some of the powerful features which ACR contains. It's also worth noting that while this guide concentrates on Adobe Camera RAW, Adobe Lightroom contains essentially the same features, though in a couple of cases, the interface is marginally different. Before we start to look at editing proper, I thought it would be useful to look briefly at file types. When you're doing anything more than very simple editing, it's always best to start with the highest quality image available. That's why most serious photographers prefer to shoot in RAW when quality is the prime concern. Take a look at these 4 files. They are all the same image but have been saved in different file formats. All the images look very similar, if not identical. All have the same resolution, 9504 by 6336 pixels. The file sizes, however, are very different, as each file type contains a different amount of data for each pixel. The first file is a .arw file, an unprocessed RAW file, from a Sony camera, and is a little over 60 megabytes. The second is an Adobe DNG file, converted directly from the RAW file, and is around 48 megabytes. The slightly smaller file size is achieved by using lossless compression. Clever algorithms reduce the file size, without losing any of the original data. The third is a JPEG file produced in camera at the same time as the original RAW file. It's around 8 megabytes. The reduction in file size is significant, but is achieved by selectively discarding some of the original data. Once discarded, that data is lost forever. Finally, the fourth is an uncompressed TIFF file, converted directly from the RAW file, and is around 172 megabytes. Note that this is actually considerably larger than the original RAW file. It could be made smaller using lossless compression, but at the moment contains a lot of empty data. To see what effect the lossy data compression has on the ability to edit JPEG files, let's open the original RAW file, and the JPEG file, in Adobe Camera RAW. First, I'll open the raw.arw file. I'll do this from within Photoshop. From the menu, I'll select File, Open and locate falmouth.arw. It will open in Adobe Camera RAW, as it's not directly editable in Photoshop in its current state. I'll make sure that the clipping display is turned on, by selecting the markers at the top of the histogram. Areas where the image is overexposed or blown, and data is missing, will now be highlighted in red. Areas that are underexposed, and data is missing, will be highlighted in blue. In an ideal world, with a typical image there will usually be no, or very few, red or blue highlights. At first sight there appears to be no blue or red highlighted areas in this image. There is detail in the whole image, including in the deep shadows and the bright sky. Looking a bit more carefully and zooming in, I can in fact see there are some small blue highlights in the deep shadow areas. There are also a couple very small red highlights in the sky above the tower and on what looks like lights on the quayside. However, these are very small areas, and insignificant in the context of the whole image. There are no large areas that are under or overexposed. Okay, I'll switch off the clipping for now, and then close this image. I'll just select Cancel, to abandon any changes and return to Photoshop. So now I'll open the JPEG file from Photoshop. This is a directly editable file, so we'll open in Photoshop. To open it in Adobe Camera RAW, I'll need to go to the menu and select Filter, Camera RAW Filter. OK, that does not look too bad, not significantly different from the RAW file at first glance. I'll now enable clipping as I did before to show the areas of under and overexposure. Oh! No need to zoom in this time. There are quite a lot of very obvious blue highlighted areas in the shadows where there is no detail. A large area of the sky is also highlighted in red, showing no detail there either. The JPEG file contains a lot less data than the RAW file. A significant amount of data has been discarded to achieve the smaller file size. In a similar, but normally less obvious way, JPEG compression also combines similar colors to reduce file size. This can lead to the banding of subtle gradients, and the creation of artifacts. The greater the compression you select, or the less quality you choose, the more aggressive is the process and more data is thrown away. Let's cancel, and return to Photoshop. If you must edit JPEG files, then to maintain quality, keep a copy of the original and save copies of it. Use the Save as Copy option. For optimal image quality, always save JPEG files with maximum quality to minimize any data loss. It's also worth noting that every time a JPEG file is edited and resaved, lossy compression will occur again, so each edit and subsequent save can result in additional data loss. In some cases it won't matter if a lot of data is discarded, in other cases though, having all the data gives you much more scope for editing, and can be vital. Take a wedding for example, a once-in-a-lifetime event that the photographer needs to capture, and produce high-quality images as a permanent record. Just to make the job awkward for the photographer, traditionally the bride dresses in white, and the groom in black or dark gray, making it tricky to expose both properly, without overexposing the bride or underexposing the groom. If that weren't tricky enough, some people like to make it even more of a challenge, placing the bride and groom against a brightly lit window, or in the deep shadows of a church, maybe some mixed and uneven lighting, or any combinations of the above. If you shoot in such situations in RAW, then your ability to produce high-quality images in such situations is greatly enhanced. Take this image of a bride preparing before the ceremony. The camera has exposed for the scene, which has rendered the bride's dress slightly overexposed. Some of the fine detail in the dress has been lost. However, as it's a RAW file, the detail is still there, and can be brought back and made visible. We'll look at the processes involved later. For now let's just say that if this were a JPEG file, your ability to recover fine detail would be a lot more limited. Okay. Enough of file types. Let's get to grips with Adobe Camera RAW. I'm going to open the file Kirsty1ARW. This is a RAW file produced by a Sony camera. As it's a RAW file, it's not directly editable in Photoshop, so we'll open in Adobe Camera RAW. As you can see, it's not the world's best image. However, I've chosen it as it will allow us to see some of the powerful editing features in Adobe Camera RAW. Remember that whatever you do to the RAW file, it's non-destructive. The original RAW file data is never modified, never removed and never added to. Any changes you make are written as a set of instructions, linked to the original file. Where this set of instructions is located, varies according to the editing application and original file type. In the case of traditional RAW files, .cr2, .nef, .arw etc., the instructions are in the form of an XMP sidecar file. With Adobe DNG files, the editing instructions are normally appended and embedded within the DNG file itself. If you are using Lightroom, then the instructions are held in the Lightroom catalog. Optionally, you can choose to have them as an XMP sidecar file as well. Before we start editing, let's just have a brief look at the ACR interface. The main editing window occupies the majority of the screen. Above the image is the title bar, which shows the name of the file and brief details of the camera that produced it. On the right of the title bar there are three icons. The first allows you to save a copy of the file in various formats. The second, that looks like a cog wheel, allows you to modify some of the Adobe Camera RAW settings. The rightmost icon expands the Adobe Camera RAW tool to fill the screen. Below the main picture area is the film strip. This is only really useful if you open multiple images at once. We'll look at that later. If you'd rather have the film strip down the side, you can do that by going to Settings, the cog icon, and on the General tab, select Film Strip and change it to vertical. There are also options here to toggle the file name and image rating on or off. Below the film strip is the info strip. The section on the far left shows the magnification level, which you can also change using the drop-down box next to it. The button to the right of the drop-down toggles the film strip on or off. The other two icons here allow you to sort and filter the images on the film strip. I suppose this could be useful if you have a lot of images open, but it's not something I've personally used. In the center of the info strip are the rating stars. If an image has been rated in Camera, or in another application such as Lightroom, then the rating can be seen here. You can also use it to rate or amend the existing rating of an image. This is a pretty average image, so I'll rate it as 2-star. Next to the rating stars is a bin or trash icon. If you select this, the image will not be deleted immediately. This simply flags the image as, for deletion, editing is disabled and a warning is displayed in the main window, but the image is not deleted, not yet anyway. Any images flagged for deletion are deleted, without further warning, when you click Done, and close Adobe Camera RAW. Under the ratings there is also a summary information tag that shows the color space, bit depth, image resolution and file size. On the right are two other icons that allow you to compare the before and after results of your editing. You can do the same thing with the P and Q keys. P switches between the current preview and original images. Q cycles through various views including side by side and under and over. Over on the right bottom corner are some more useful tools. The one at the top that looks like a magnifying glass is the zoom tool. This can be used to zoom in and out on the image. You can also use Ctrl+ to zoom in, Ctrl- to zoom out, and Ctrl-0 to fit to screen. Just like in Photoshop. For some reason, best known to Adobe, you can't use Ctrl-1 to zoom to 100%, you have to use Ctrl-Alt-D instead. Below the zoom tool is the hand tool. The hand tool is used to move around the image on screen. This is used when not all of the image is visible and you want to concentrate on a particular area. As with Photoshop, you can also hold the spacebar to select the hand tool temporarily and move around the image. Below the hand tool is the color sampler or eyedropper tool. This is for selecting a color from the image. Holding the Shift key also selects the color sampler. Used in its crudest form, clicking on the image with the color sampler displays the RGB values at the selected points. At the bottom, the grid tool toggles a grid on or off. This is sometimes useful for composition and cropping purposes. At the top of the sidebar on the right are the main editing tool selection icons. The icon at the top selects the main editing panels and sliders. This is what you can see on the screen now. We'll look at the panels themselves in more detail later. Under the editing icon is the crop tool. Holding the Shift key while cropping retains the original ratio. The crop can be rotated too, but that's as good as it gets. It has to be said that the cropping tool in Photoshop is a lot more versatile. Personally, I rarely crop images in Adobe Camera RAW, but I'll make an exception here. The sticking plaster icon is the spot removal tool, used for removing blemishes from the image. Below that are the masking tools. These are used to apply settings to selected parts of the image, rather than to the whole image. We'll look at that in more detail later. The eye icon is the red eye removal tool. Red eye can sometimes result from flash bouncing off the subject's retina. This tool can remove the redness from the eyes. Once again though, it's not as flexible as the Photoshop equivalent. The stacked pages icon is for snapshots. This allows you to save the current state of the image, which you can revert back to easily. The two overlapping circles icon is for presets. Presets are collections of settings used to apply specific styles to images. Presets are shared with Lightroom in the latest versions of Photoshop. Just like Lightroom, hovering over a preset allows you to see the effect of a preset before you apply it. Finally, the three dots hide a few additional options, such as the ability to load and save settings that didn't fit in anywhere else. Before we look at the editing tools in detail, it's just worth looking at the buttons at the bottom of the screen. Open commits the changes you've made, and then opens the file with your edits in Photoshop. Cancel discards your changes and closes the image. Done commits the edits but does not open the edited image in Photoshop. Holding the Alt key changes the menus. Open becomes Open Copy, that creates a copy of the edited image and loads that into Photoshop. Cancel becomes Reset. All the edits are thrown away, but the file is not closed. You can then start editing again. Each of the sections in the editing panels also changes to Reset when you hold Alt. This allows you to discard all the edits in a section, while keeping the others. Time to look at the editing panels themselves. The panels divide the editing tasks into sections and are arranged in order of what Adobe considers to be a typical workflow. If the order of the panels does not suit your workflow, you can reorder them. For example, I tend to do detail, which includes things like sharpening, last. So I can right-click on any panel and select Edit Panels to show. I can then select the Detail panel, and use the arrow keys to move it to the bottom. If there are some panels that you never use, then you can hide them. I never use the calibration panel, so I'll just untick it. You can reorder and hide and unhide panels at any time to suit your needs and workflow. Above the panels is the histogram. This graph shows the distribution of pixels according to brightness, and some basic exposure details relating to the image including ISO, aperture and shutter speed. The extreme left of the histogram represents absolute black, the extreme right of the histogram represents absolute white. The area between black and white is divided into zones that represent shadows, midtones and highlights. The height of the graph represents the distribution of pixels according to their brightness. You can enable the clipping display by selecting the markers at the top of the histogram. The clipping display will highlight under and overexposed areas. Areas so underexposed they are completely black are highlighted with blue. Areas so overexposed that they are pure white are highlighted with red. As you can see from the histogram in this image, most of the pixels are on the left, meaning that the image is quite dark. There are almost no pixels in the highlight or white areas of the histogram. This suggests that the image may be underexposed, which it might be. We'll come back to that in a minute. Images where the histogram is skewed to the left like this are generally termed low key. Images where the histogram is skewed to the right are termed high key. Below the histogram, on the Edit tab there are two presets, Auto and B&W. If you select Auto, then Camera RAW will apply a predetermined algorithm to apply some basic corrections to your image. Often this is not perfect, or does not apply the mood or style that you may have had in mind, but it's often a good starting point for editing. If I select Auto, on this image you can see it does not do a bad job. The image is made a little brighter, and the histogram moves to the right, but the mood of the image is largely retained. The B&W option applies default black and white conversion. Again, not perfect but a good starting point in many cases. It is possible to select both the Auto and B&W options, or to select them individually. I'll select Auto for now, but forego the B&W option. Okay, let's open some panels and see how those work. Let's start at the top and click on the basic panel to open it. The first adjustment option I want to look at is white balance. This is set to a shot by default and is taken from the setting you applied in camera when the image was taken. The drop-down box lets you select a white balance preset, in much the same way as you could have set it in camera. This can be very useful if you forgot to set the correct white balance when shooting, or you want to tweak it after the event. It's worth noting that these options are only available as this is a RAW file. If this had been a JPEG that you have brought into ACR using the filter, Camera RAW option, then the only options in the dropdown would be a shot and auto. Next to the dropdown is an eyedropper or sampler tool. You can use this to click on a color neutral area of the image, that's something that's pure white, pure black or a neutral gray, and Photoshop will attempt to automatically adjust the white balance accordingly. This is particularly useful if you have shot an image in unusual or mixed lighting conditions. Many photographers will use a gray card, white card, black card, or something called a color passport, which is a combination of all three, plus some key colors, and include this in some images to provide a basis for accurate adjustment. Also in the white balance section is the temperature slider. You can use this to manually adjust and fine-tune the color temperature. By sliding it to the left, you can cool down the image, by sliding it to the right you can warm the image up. If you are editing a RAW file, then the actual color temperature is shown in degrees Kelvin, ranging from 2000 degrees Kelvin, very cold and blue, to 50,000 degrees Kelvin, very warm and yellow. Normal daylight is usually in the region of 5,400 to 6,000 degrees Kelvin. If you're editing a JPEG, then the options are more restricted. You can still use the temperature slider, but the range is shown on a relative scale from -100 to +100, and not in degrees K. By the way, double-clicking on any slider will set it back to its default value, which is normally, but not always, in the center. While the color temperature slider largely affects the blue-yellow area of the spectrum, the tint slider below it can be used to fine-tune color by modifying the green-magenta balance. This ranges from -150, very green, to +150, very magenta. Below the white balance sliders is a group of sliders that control the general exposure of the image. At the top of this group is the general exposure slider. You can use this to increase, or decrease, the overall exposure of the entire image. Below that is the contrast slider. Again, this adjusts the whole image. The highlight slider can be used to modify the exposure in much the same way as the exposure slider, but it only affects the highlight tones. Mid-tones and shadows are unaffected. In a similar way, the shadows slider affects exposure, but only in the shadow tones. The whites slider affects only the whites. And the black slider affects only the darkest tones of the image. Using these sliders, it's possible to increase the effective dynamic range of the photograph. You can bring out detail hidden in the shadows, and prevent blown highlights, while balancing the tones in the image. The next set of 3 sliders control the texture of the image. The texture slider itself works on medium-sized details and is used to increase, or decrease, the prominence of texture in a photo, without affecting the fine details or contrast. Decreasing texture can be useful for portraits, when you want to soften or minimize the appearance of skin texture. Increasing texture can be very effective on black and white images. The clarity slider adjusts the contrast, but only in the mid-tones. It will not add texture to the highlight or shadow areas. It is a useful tool for some photos, just be careful of overusing it, as it can produce very harsh and unrealistic edges or plasticky skin. The dehaze slider works much like the contrast tool, but with added saturation and clarity. It works well for recovering detail even from hazy or foggy images. Dehaze can enhance the contrast in a localized way, without pushing the histogram into clipping the highlights or shadows, as a regular contrast adjustment would. The final 2 sliders at the bottom of the basic panel control the intensity of colors. The difference is that vibrance detects highly saturated portions of the scene, as well as skin tones, and protects them, while adjusting the saturation on the rest of the image. It's smart. In contrast, saturation is dumb. It simply adjusts the intensity of every color in the entire image, regardless of its current level. Okay, let's have a look at the curve panel. The curve panel allows you to make precise luminance and color adjustments to an image. Anything from slightly raising a specific region of the mid-tones to drastic highlight changes. Curves are powerful tools that when used correctly can bring your image to life. There are 5 main curve options. The first is used as a global curves adjustment, and changes all the other subsections. The white circle allows you to change the black and white tone, lightening some tones and darkening others. The red circle allows you to change the red cyan tones. The green circle allows you to change the green magenta tones. while the last one, the blue circle, allows you to adjust the blue-yellow tones. The basic idea is you can select a tone, then increase or decrease the intensity of that tone, or maybe make a certain shade of red a little more or less intense, by adding or subtracting its complementary color. This is done by clicking on the curve to select the tone, then dragging the curve up or down, to adjust the tone. You can add different adjustments to different curves, and add as many additional points on each curve as you want. The classic curve, which tends to give pleasing results, is an S-curve. If you make a mess, remember you can always hold Alt and then reset curve. Below the curves chart, there is a drop-down box with some common presets. Linear, the straight line, medium, and high contrast presets are listed. Anything else is custom. If at any point you want to compare the image with and without the curve adjustments, then you can hold down the little eye icon at the top of the panel. This useful option is true of all panels. Since it can be difficult to know which tone you are actually changing when you click on the curve, there is another icon on the far right which opens the targeted adjustment tool. This produces a floating toolbar on the image. You have the same tools on the floating toolbar, as appear above the curves chart in the panel, and as before, you can select which curve you want to change. What makes this so powerful though, is that you can select the curve, then click and hold on the tone in the actual image, then drag right or left to adjust the curve. Using curves can take practice, but it can pay dividends. The next panel we'll look at is the color mixer. If you open this panel, you'll see that there are two ways of looking at this, the HSL view and the color view. They are both slightly different ways of looking at the same thing. In color view, the spectrum is represented by 8 colored circles arranged horizontally, with a hue, saturation and luminance slider for each color group below. In HSL view, the spectrum is divided into 8 sections arranged vertically. At the top of the sliders there are options for hue, the color of the color, the saturation or intensity of the color, and the luminance, or brightness of the color. There is also a fourth option, all, that displays and allows you to edit all 3 at the same time. Personally, I prefer to use the HSL view most of the time, so I'll concentrate on this one. So if I choose hue, and then select the red slider, I can change the actual color of the red tones of the image. If I choose saturation, I can control the intensity or depth of the selected tone. Moving the saturation slider all the way to the left removes all the color from that tone, effectively rendering it black and white. The luminance option allows the brightness for the tone to be controlled. Clearly, all the other color groups can be modified in the same way. Sometimes, if you want to modify a particular color, it can be difficult to know what color it actually is, and which slider to select. Grass, for example, may look green, but in reality can actually be composed mainly of yellow tones. To help with this, there is the targeted selection tool. This tool is the same floating toolbar as used in the curve panel, and works in the same way. You select the hue, saturation or luminance option on the toolbar. Then click and hold on the color you want to change and drag right or left to make the changes. Using the color mixer, you can make subtle, or not so subtle changes to the tones in your image. Below the color mixer panel is color grading. The color grading panel allows you to add a color tint to different tonal ranges in the image. I'm not going to get into color theory here, that's a complete topic in its own right, but I'll just explain briefly how this panel works. Essentially, color grading is all about making artistic adjustments to the colors in your image, to convey a mood or style. Common techniques include the use of complementary colors and crushing the blacks. At the top of the panel there are icons to select, from right to left. A global color wheel that applies a tint to the whole image. A color wheel for adjusting the highlight tones. A color wheel for adjusting the midtones. A color wheel for adjusting the shadows. And on the left, the option of a three-way view, that shows all three tonal color wheels at the same time. So, if you wanted to apply a sepia tone across the whole image, you could just select the global color wheel, and drag into the orangey brown area. There are also hue saturation and luminance sliders you can use to achieve the same result. If you can't see the sliders, open them with the little triangle at the bottom right of the color wheel. The other color wheels allow you to apply different tints to different tonal ranges in the image. Using complementary, or opposite colors in shadows and highlights can be quite effective. There are also two other sliders at the bottom of the panel. The blending slider allows you to control the amount of overlap between the shadows and highlights. The balance slider balances the effect. Move the slider left to increase the effect in the shadows. Or, move the slider right to increase the effect in the highlights. If you mess things up, you can always hold Alt and then click Reset Color Grading. Below the color grading panel is the optics panel. The optics panel lets you apply adjustments to the image resulting from the optical properties of the lens. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use another image. To allow me to load the new image, I first need to tell Adobe Camera RAW that I'm done with the current image. I could just click Done to save the changes and close the image. However, in this case I'm going to click Open, which will confirm the changes made, and open the modified image into Photoshop. Once in Photoshop, I can then use Photoshop to open Clowns.cr2. This is a RAW file from a Canon camera. Because it's a RAW file, it will open in Adobe Camera RAW. The first thing I want to look at is chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration can sometimes be seen as a colored outline in high contrast areas such as buildings or trees against a bright sky. It's caused by the lens focusing the different colors of light slightly differently. While manufacturers go to great lengths to reduce chromatic aberration with special lens elements and coatings, some chromatic aberration is inevitable, especially with zoom lenses. This is a good lens, It's a Canon lens after all, and there's no obvious chromatic aberration. However, if I zoom in to where the top of the building meets the sky, you can see a very faint cyan line around the top of the building, and a magenta tint around the bottom of one of the decorative globes. If, under the Profile section on the Optics panel, I select Remove Chromatic Aberration, Photoshop will attempt to automatically remove it. It generally does a good job. If for some reason automatic removal fails, you can manually remove the chromatic aberration. Click on Manual. Go to the Defringe options, then use the sliders to select the color of the fringing to be removed, and how aggressive the removal should be for that color. Alternatively, you can use the eyedropper to select the colors to be removed. As well as producing some chromatic aberration, most lenses will also introduce some optical distortion. Most of the time such distortion is insignificant and is not obvious, but sometimes it can be more prominent. Adobe Camera RAW will normally be able to detect which camera and lens was used to take the image. This allows a profile to be applied that contains details about the nature of the distortion at different settings, thereby correcting it. In the Profile section, if you select Use Profile Corrections, then Adobe Camera RAW will use the profile to apply corrections to the image to remove optical distortion. If for some reason Camera RAW is unable to determine the lens, or if no profile for the lens exists, or if you just want to modify the results, then you can make adjustments manually. Go to the Manual section and adjust the distortion and vignette sliders by eye. Below the Optics panel is the Geometry panel. The Geometry panel is like a distortion slider on steroids. It can be used to change the perspective of the image. For best results, lens profile should always be applied first in the Optics panel. There are some presets along the top of the panel. The first option, a no entry sign, is no modification. The A is for automatic or balanced perspective modification. To the left is an icon with horizontal lines. This option will adjust the image using any obvious horizontal lines in the image, and make them level. The icon with vertical lines does much the same but in the vertical plane. The icon that looks like a grid makes sure that both horizontal and vertical alignment is done. The last icon, the one that looks a bit like the crop tool, allows you to draw up to 4 guides. You can draw a combination of horizontal and vertical guides on the image. These are then used to modify the alignment and adjust the image. This can be especially useful if Camera RAW can't determine any horizontal or vertical lines, or no such lines exist in the photo. If the geometry presets don't do as you want, then you can open the manual transformation sliders and use them to adjust the image manually. The Effects panel has just 2 main sliders, Grain and Vignette, but each slider has some sub-sliders. Let's zoom into the stonework. Applying the grain filter adds texture, most prominent on the stone. The sub-sliders control the grain size and roughness. Notice how the grain is applied to the stonework and the effect in the sky is much less. Unsurprisingly, the vignette slider can be used to add a vignette. Dragging the slider to the right produces a white vignette. Dragging to the left a black vignette. The sub-sliders can be used to control the style, hardness and shape of the vignette. Sometimes a very subtle dark vignette can be useful in drawing the viewer's eye to the subject of the image, but in most cases it pays to keep it subtle. The final panel I'll look at is the detail panel. This is concerned with sharpening and noise reduction. JPEGs may not need sharpening at all, or at least not as much, because some sharpening is applied during the in-camera conversion. However, RAW files will almost always need to be sharpened at some point in the workflow. Where and how you sharpen images is, to some extent, a matter of personal choice and individual workflow. Traditionally, sharpening is one of the final steps. Much the same applies to noise reduction. Digital noise can take two main forms. Grain, which gives the image a textured effect, and color noise, which takes the form of random color speckles. There are sliders for these three detail elements, and each slider has some sub-sliders. Let's deal with sharpening first. Moving the slider to the right increases sharpening. The sharpening slider cannot bring back lost detail in a photo. It only creates the illusion of detail and sharpness by adding contrast to edges. The sub-sliders control how the edge contrast looks and where it appears. The radius slider controls the thickness of the edge where the contrast is applied. Lower values give you a thinner edge. The detail slider controls the amount of sharpening applied. A low value sharpens only the prominent edges, while a high value sharpens even the smallest details. Take care not to over-sharpen, as it can make your images very noisy. The masking slider allows you to control where the sharpening is applied. With the slider set to 0, the sharpening is applied to the entire photo, which is rarely desirable. You don't want to sharpen large expanses of sky, for example. As you drag the slider to the right, the sharpening will be reduced over the image and remain only at the edges. That sounds good in theory, but you can't see where the sharpening is happening very easily. A good tip for using the masking slider in particular is to hold the Alt key as you drag the slider. Areas to which sharpening will be applied are shown in white. Now you can more easily adjust the masking so it only applies to the edges you want. Drag the slider until only the prominent edges are selected. If there is digital noise visible, it may be most prominent in the sky and/or highlights, then you can adjust the noise reduction slider to remove it. If there is any color noise visible, usually most prominent in the dark areas, then it can be removed or reduced with the color noise removal slider. As it happens, this image is pretty clean. Okay, let's have a look at some other images, and put together some processes for tweaking them in Adobe Camera RAW. I'll get rid of this one for now by canceling the edits, and load several images into Camera RAW. You can open multiple images in Adobe Camera RAW directly, by opening the RAW files from Photoshop, or by opening them via Adobe Bridge. However, you can only open a single image at a time from Photoshop using the Camera RAW filter option. Notice that when I open multiple images, they all appear as thumbnails on the film strip. I can of course change the layout of the film strip, as we saw at the beginning of this guide, by going into Settings and changing the layout and options there. Alternatively, I can right-click on the film strip and make the changes. Let's start with the photo of the boat. First thing to notice is that the horizon isn't quite level. If you look carefully, you can see that it's lower on the left and higher on the right. I have a number of options I can use to level the horizon. I could use the crop tool, of course. Within the crop tool, there is a level option, which I can use to draw a horizontal guide. Alternatively, I could use the geometry panel to level the horizon. As there are no obvious horizontal or vertical structures, the presets are unlikely to work. But I can use the option to draw my own guides. One horizontal guide, along the horizon. And one vertical guide through the lighthouse should be enough. Okay, that looks better. Let's try the next image, the girl in the poppies. On this image, I really want to enhance the very bland sky. I can do this by decreasing its exposure slightly, and then add some clarity and contrast. The problem is that I only want to adjust the sky. I don't want to affect the rest of the image. I could choose the mask option from the tools, choose a brush, and paint over the sky. The red mask will show where the adjustment will apply. I can make the brush bigger or smaller with the square bracket keys. When I change the sliders, the effect on the selected area will be shown. The problem is that this method is time-consuming and not very accurate. There are better ways. I'll reset the mask and look at another option. Rather than use a brush, I can choose the linear gradient tool, which will work well as my horizon is quite flat. I'll select the masking icon, then select the linear gradient tool, and drag out a gradient from top to bottom. This will create a graduated mask, allowing me to add adjustments that are more effective at the top of the image, and get progressively weaker further down. The length of the stroke, when dragging out the gradient, determines how gentle or harsh the gradient is. So having created a mask on the sky, I can reduce its exposure a bit. Increase the contrast. And add a bit of clarity and dehaze. So far so good, but that's now resulted in some black blobs in the sky. These seem to be mainly birds, and maybe one blob of sensor dust. It's probably best that all the spots are removed, so I'll use the spot removal tool to remove them. After choosing the spot removal brush, I can make the brush bigger, or smaller, using the square bracket keys. Then remove each spot by selecting it, and replacing the selected area from an adjoining part of the image. I also want to draw the viewer's eye to the girl's face. One way to do this would be to brighten the face a touch. I can use the mask tool again to brighten the face. I'll select a new mask, and select the brush. I'll resize the brush with the square bracket keys, mask over the face, then increase the exposure slightly. There, I think that looks a little better. Moving to the image of the house at clouds. Again, it's an image with a rather bland sky. This time though, because the house breaks into the sky, it's not possible to use a linear gradient as it would affect the house as well. I suppose it could use a soft brush to mask the sky, but as we've seen already, it's not very accurate and can be time consuming. And even then, I'm still going to have issues with those trees. The solution is to use the Select Sky mask, which you can see, does an excellent job, even in the trees. I can then apply my adjustments. Job done. On to the next photo of Nuki. I want to enhance the sky a little, so I'll use the masking tool to select sky, then make my adjustments. But I also want to reduce the highlights, and decrease the strong colors in the rest of the image. I'll start by creating another mask and selecting the sky again. This time though, I'll right-click on the mask in the info box, and select Invert Mask. The mask now applies to everything except the sky. I'll just reduce the highlights a little, and tone down the bright colors by decreasing the saturation. That will do nicely. On to the image of the house. The photo was taken in very bright sunlight. This has resulted in very bright highlights and very dark shadows. If I switch on clipping, then we can see some areas and the shadows have no detail at all, they are completely black. I'll increase the overall exposure a little, taking care not to clip the highlights as I do. Then I'll lift the shadows to show more detail. Then I'll reduce the highlights a little to maintain the balance. That looks a little better. On to the next image, the girl in the woods. Overall the image may be a little dark, but I like the mood, and want to keep that feeling in the image. However, I want to brighten up the girl to make her more prominent. There are a number of ways I can select the girl and do this. I could of course select the masking tool and use a brush to trace over the girl. It may take a little time and effort but would work quite well. I'm not going to do it that way though. Another option is to use the masking tool and create a radial gradient over the girl. The radial gradient can be shaped and rotated to cover the girl. Then I can make the adjustments to brighten her. The problem with this is of course, that if I'm not careful, I may also affect some of the background within the gradient. With this particular image I could probably avoid that by lifting only the highlights, but that's not always going to be the case. Once again there is an alternative. Rather than use the radial gradient, I can use the Select Subject mask. This works well in most cases. If necessary, you can always refine the mask with the brush tool. With only the girl selected, I can make the adjustments without affecting anything else in the image. To add extra emphasis to the girl, I'll create a new mask and use a radial gradient and place it over her, but this time I'll invert it. If I now very carefully, slightly darken and desaturate the air around her, that it will help to make her stand out from the foliage. To finish, I'll make one other adjustment. By selecting a new mask, and choosing a brush, I can mask over the path and brighten that a little to add prominence to the lead-in line. Looking good. Moving to the image of the coast. First I'll straighten and slightly crop the image using the crop tool. If I hold Alt, and double-click on the crop tool, it will crop and straighten in one action. Next I'll select the sky, and just darken it just a little. Then I'll select a new mask, select the sky, and invert it, so that everything except the sky is selected. Then I'll add a bit of saturation and texture. I'll then make a snapshot, so I can get back to this point again easily, and call it Basic Edit. I'll leave the date/time that is used as a default and add the name to the end. The reason for this is that snapshots are listed in alphabetical order, not in the order they are created. If you leave the timestamp, it's a lot less confusing. I'll then attempt to increase the impact of the image by adjusting the curve. And then take another snapshot, naming it after curve. Next I'll go to the presets, and scroll through to see what effect the presets have on my image. When I see one I like, I'll select it, then make another snapshot. I can now switch between snapshots as I want. Almost done. Finally, I'm going to load another set of RAW files to demonstrate another feature of Adobe Camera RAW. I'll get rid of these images first. I'll just select all the images then click Done, which will save the adjustments I've made, but not load the images into Photoshop. Then I'll load a set of images from a studio shoot. Being from the same shoot, they have similar characteristics and may all need to be edited in a similar way. You can use the Control key, and click on the thumbnails to select multiple images, or you can use Control A, to select all the images. Then I can make adjustments, and any changes will apply to all the selected images. As you make the adjustments, you may notice yellow warning triangles appear over the thumbnails. This indicates that adjustments are in the process of being applied. Another option you can use is to copy and paste adjustments from one image to another. I'll select the first image and make some adjustments to it. Then I'll right-click on the thumbnail. There are two options to copy adjustments. Copy Edit Settings, which copies the default settings, that's everything except geometry, crop, masking and spot removal, since these are unlikely to be the same for all images. And, Copy Selected Edit Settings. This allows you to choose which settings you want to copy. The default is the same as before, but you can tick any groups on or off as you require. Having copied settings, you can then right-click on any image, or group of images, and paste the settings to those images. If you want to paste settings to all the images, you can select all by right-clicking and choosing Select All, or with Control A, and then Paste. So that just about wraps it up. That concludes this little guide, produced by Adobe Camera Club, Redruth. We hope you found it useful. If there are any other topics you'd like us to cover, then we're open to suggestions. Please get in touch via our website, carncaiccameraclub.co.uk, or via our Facebook page. Finally, don't forget that Adobe Camera Club, the friendly camera club, meets every Wednesday at 7 o'clock, in the Adobe Institute Redruth. New members always welcome.